Okay, hello, good morning, hi. Good morning, everybody. I'm Peter. Like Jan said, I'm the editor at Lorandom, and really excited today to host this talk with three of the artists that I think are doing some of the most cutting edge work with AI today, and I'm really interested in digging into these practices. So we have Sougwen, Chung, Sofia, Crespo, and Feileacan, McCormick. This is, I think I'm excited about this talk because at first glance, I think it might not seem like there's that much overlap between these practices, but I think both explore the topic of entanglement very deeply, and I'd like to maybe untangle that today and look at how both of their approaches are actually, they're asking quite similar questions. So maybe we can start with Sougwen.
Sounds great.
Oh, and I think we'll be showing work behind throughout, so you can kind of get a sense of their practice. And also, for us up here, we can use this if you want to change the slides or anything like that. But so they won't be happening automatically, but we can also we can change them if we want to. Okay, sorry. Having a technical difficulty with my phone.
Yeah, thanks so much for being with us this morning. I think it's been a really intense week, so it's nice to see some fresh and not so fresh faces here.
Yes, thank you. And I am, I think, one of the not so fresh ones. Okay, so yeah, maybe we can start with Sougwen. And Sougwen, we recently were in touch because I was writing a paper, or writing a piece that will come out in the art newspaper next month. And I reached out to you for comments, and they turned out to be quite applicable to this talk. So in those comments, you said, in collaboration, there's always change, mutual exchange, promise, peril. It implies a relational risk and entanglement, a kind of exchange. So entangled others may carry the name of with entanglement, but I do think I do believe that both of you center this idea of interconnectedness and entanglement in your practice. And I wondered, Sougwen, yours is more through human-machine collaboration. Sofia and Crespo and Feileacan, we'll talk about how yours is a little bit different, but yours is more about considering ecologies and technology. And I wonder, how has, in those comments that you said to me, that in collaboration there's always change. So I'm wondering, how has your entanglement with the machine changed you, Sougwen? And what are the risks and perils of that entanglement that you mentioned in the comments?
Thank you for those questions. I think one of my favorite parts of the practice is being able to kind of engage not only in the nature of the work, but the nature of work. So it's been a really, profoundly interesting catalyst for the practice as well. But so I've been, for those who don't know, I've been exploring the space of human and machine relational gesture since 2014, 2015. And I think I was doing so back then because I was really interested in thinking about how to engage with my practice and with technology in a way that kind of can foreground curiosity and criticality at the same time. So I became really interested in building a robotic system to feed back to me different types of my own personal data, crowd data, as a kind of collaborator to see how that would change my mark, to see how that would change me as an engineer. And I think over the past 10 years of working in this space, it's really been about learning so much more about what these technological effects and these technological systems, embodied systems, AI systems, are really how they can shape a practice, but how also the practice can shape the tools that we build, and how they can shape our conception of a machine and shape our conception of like ourselves and shape our conception of drawing. So I think the change has been really profound because I don't think a lot of practitioners get to work in a medium that also by nature changes the medium. So that's been really wonderful, and I think I write about the perils and promises of technology, and I think it's really driven by my explorations are driven by that question. So it's not kind of a something to tolerate, but it's really one of the driving forces. Like what's actually happening when we work with an AI system? How is a robot? How does a robot see? What are the sensors involved? So yeah, it's been a really lovely journey.
Yeah, did you want to say anything about any dangers and perils of that relationship?
Yeah, I think I think one of my central questions in the early days was, you know, what happens when you can program a machine to draw? What does that turn, and especially what happens when in Generation 2 memory, which we debuted in 2016, what happens when you make your drawing archives machine readable and when you implicate that back into the space of the creative process? I think that as an idea has really taken a lot of traction in 2025 and 2023, many years after. So I think one of the questions, and something that I know we're going to talk about today, is the question of authorship and data. What happens when you when you turn creative data that was maybe not meant to be machine readable into something that is machine readable for an AI system? So I think that's definitely been one of the tensions explored in the work. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I don't want to take up too much of the first question. But I think that question of authorship and agency has been really one of the tensions at the heart of the practice.
Yeah, yeah, we'll definitely
Yeah.
cover the authorship and agency. I think that's such rich terrain that your work opens up for investigation, and it's something that I've written a lot about at Lorandom, and so yeah, one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be able to chat today. And yeah, I guess Sofia and Feileacan, it's a similar question that. Whereas Sougwen highlights the interconnectedness of humans and machines, your work highlights the interconnectedness of all living beings, and there's even, of course, this double meaning to your practice's name, Entangled Others, that where you as a creative duo are entangled as well. And so I'm just wondering how those two things are connected and how they inform each other. How does that ecological awareness of interconnectedness, how does that relate to your creative practices' interconnectedness?
Yeah, so when we started collaborating sort of more formally as Entangled Others, we spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of umbrella did we want to place our practice within, because we'd been for years before, both individually and also together, trying to sort of make sense of, you know, our interests around the natural world, around the modern human. And we also were trying to chip away at the sense that there was somehow a divide between the digital and the physical. Because when you look at the world around you, really examine it, there is no actual line you can draw between what is digital and what is physical. It's, you know, the digital is generally just, you know, arcane inscriptions on bits of rock. So very much it's still part of the physical world, and it has influences. It influences and is influenced by the physical world. And at the same time, just because we know things, just because we collect data, create systems, doesn't mean that we actually know more about the world. So when you're dealing with the natural world, the more than human, you will never know what it's like to be a tree. You know, you and I can never have that experience of being a tree. So, and at the same time, because, you know, a tree or a lichen or an algae or, you know, a jellyfish doesn't have a face, it doesn't have the mammalian interface that we know and understand. For us, it was very interesting to explore these parts of the world that we are inextricably linked to. You know, we cannot step outside the ecosystem, you know, aside from perhaps going to space. But for the majority of us, we are very much bound to being part of the world, and the world is part of us. And so how do we make sense of that? How can we try and peel back some of the layers that maybe mask, or through the sort of cultural inertia of how we use language and talk about these things, how can we create interfaces to the world around it through this technology? How does using these tools, a bit like when we first started collaborating, Sofia was very interested, or still is, very interested in microscopes as, you know, this technology that brought us closer to the world around us. Without the microscope, we would have a much poorer understanding and a much less close understanding of a lot of the, you know, the micro interactions that are actually, you know, vital to our health, to ecology, and so forth. So this is, so there is no, and I mean, we'll talk about this more today, but in of itself, technology has no moral or ethical weight in of itself. It is how it is used, it is how it is, you know, deployed into the world or implemented. But in of itself, you know, there is the potential for any technology to be as a microscope, you know, something that helps us understand, connect, and better reflect. Or it can be the opposite, of course, naturally, and that's generally what we see. But that, for us as artists, it was very interesting to explore how can we, you know, as two very different people, how can we explore, you know, these implicit, you know, these systemic connections all around us that we perhaps don't see or perceive. How can we try and use the tools available to us that are natural to us to unveil some of that innate entanglement or the phenomena that drive that?
Would you like to add anything?
No, well, I was just going to add that when we were choosing the name for our duo practice, which obviously wasn't something that happened overnight, it took us a long time, you know, because when you're a duo, there's more of a negotiation that goes into, and especially when you're very different people. And we ended up choosing Entangled Others because we like the contradiction between one word that connects and a word that separates. Because entangled implies somehow being connected to something, being related to something, but others means being separate. And something that we talk about is how the word hybrid implies separation. How when we say that something is hybrid, we're saying that two things that are meant to be separate are together. And so this is one of the things that we're actually working on right now, one of the projects that obviously we haven't published yet, is this idea of unhybrid. What does it mean if we remove that imaginary separation? Then things aren't hybrid anymore, because that separation that we created dissolves.
Yeah, I think that idea of others, I think, again, speaks to maybe an unlikely, maybe something that's shared between your practices. So this is more for Sougwen, but maybe we can all explore it. But so Deleuze suggests that certain types of collaboration result where individually we become, we are no longer ourselves. And yeah, I think that's really interesting in the context of what you were saying about the role of the other. And I think it highlights issues like authorship and agency in work. And Sougwen, you've said, I'm drawn to this idea of creative agency, what it means today, how it is granted or revoked. It's a question of authorship and value, but also of concealment and erasure. What does our desire or refusal to assign authorship to a machine say about us? So those were your words. and yeah, I'm wondering if we can dig into some of that a little deeper. So how does that desire and that refusal, that tension, reflect some of the deeper societal anxieties about some of these technologies?
That's such a massive question, right? And I think I think it's really also part of what it is to be a practitioner in 2025, to be a living person in 2025. So I think the practice really led me to that question, in that on the topic of others, right? I think about the machine other and how we other across the spectrum, right? And I think sometimes how I've always thought of the idea of a machine in general to be that projection, to be part of that projection that we have. So I think for some, this idea of a machine can be quite dystopian. I think for some, the machine represents some sort of secular theistic singularity, right? And I think that that word, I'm really, really struck by what you said, because that how we construct that character of the machine really is about our own engagement with our own internal model. And that also, I think, extends to authorship through the work through the simple act of drawing alongside a robotic unit that has a sensory apparatus to my own physical movements and has an archive of memory of my own drawing data. I've received a wealth of responses from people about what that means. I think some people find that to be quite horrific, actually, that one would engage with sort of a robotic arm in that way. It's supposed to be some sort of cosign of all technology. We were talking about that the other day. Like, what does it mean to be an artist building these systems? Does it cosign the whole history of AI and the military-industrial complex of robotics? Is that what people project onto this other that I'm working with? Or I think there's another lens for it, which is drawing sensibility evolving and artistic sensibility widening to include different practices, engineering practices, data science, performance. So I think it's, for me, the question is really something I wrestle with and sit with constantly, but that's kind of how I frame the work. There's a quote by Simone Don that I think about, which I'm going to paraphrase poorly, which is that our idea of a machine itself is one of a fictive fabrication. It's the art of illusion. And when we think about how machines are deployed in culture, we've seen that extension of a certain sensibility towards maybe creative capitalist extraction, towards automated towards certain types of automation. But I think as artists, we have the ability to reimagine the other of the machine as maybe something more relational or an expressive, and more that expresses our pluralistic, entangled reality that we live in now.
Yeah, I think those ideas of automation and extraction, I do think are, yeah, to kind of align with the theme of this talk, I think are entangled, and AI it's often associated with this high-speed automation and gets kind of flattened to insta art and automated plagiarism and things like that. And the implication there that speed and this, the unlimited sort of image-making potential of these machines is what should be foregrounded. But your practices both resist that speed as maybe a central tenet. And so maybe for Entangled Others but I'd like to get both of your takes, but maybe we can start with Sofia and Feileacan. How do you approach pace and time in your work, and how do you challenge or subvert this expectation of speed that seems to be intertwined with these technologies?
Well, one of the fun parts of making art is the fact that we don't need to keep up with the industrial expectations of, like what do we expect today of AI tools? As artists, we don't have to do that. So that's one of the things that is liberating about doing this. And certainly, our practice changed a lot, I think, from when we started to now. When we started, it was more of an intuitive process of working with the tool and the limitations of the tool. And then with time, we started to get more ambitious about crafting our own tools. But as I was saying, we don't have the same goals as the industry. So what is fun for us, actually with this system, for example, it's a very lo-fi system, really. We don't need photorealism. And actually, the weirdness of AI is really fun. Like, I really like the weird artifacts that emerge from the older tools. We once were part of a publication, I'm not going to say which one, but we were part of a publication that took a really long time to come out, like 1 year. And at the end, I remember the editor said, well, it took so long to get this publication out now that all these artworks are obsolete. And we were like, what? And I think this expectation that, the artwork has to be always using the latest, most cutting edge tool in order to be of the present time, for me, that makes no sense. I still use the tools that I was using in 2018, and actually, I'm able to get better resolution because I have better compute, because obviously, I fine-tuned a lot of little things, but I run the code pretty much the same way that I ran it in 2018. And I still find a lot of interesting things to explore. So yeah, that's what's fun about this. We don't have to do tech demos with our work, right?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add to that, I think one thing that's perhaps important to mention is, at least from my point of view, I consider our works fundamentally site-specific and perhaps closer to, the tradition of land art than anything else, because just because we're working with digital tools does not mean that there is no site specificity to it. Actually, whether it's the data sets you create, whether it's the algorithm you code, these are very contextualized things. There is a context. It's both the context of your practice, but it's also the context of compute tools, the greater conversations that are happening. And of course, as with any technology, and this has, been the case for many decades now, there is always a tension between the world of products, of industrialization, of automation, and so on, versus that of the artist practice. And I think, especially because of the art washing that's taken place over the last few years, where you have a lot of products being marketed as art machines or art engines, when in fact they're content engines at best, has produced this great conflation and this mixed expectation of what artists are doing or supposed to be doing with technology. And I think it's very important that, especially because a lot of the machine learning and deep learning tools and architectures and so forth that emerged have emerged from research institutions and then later been, co-opted and appropriated and, turned into massive multi-billion, funding rounds, does not mean that they are now the ownership of the corporate. And I think it's very important as artists that we get to work site-specific, that we get to show, no, actually, this, whatever they're doing there is entirely irrelevant. Like, this is the interesting thing for us. This is what we want to touch upon. It might not be, photorealistic. It might not be fast. I mean, most of our work takes like 1 to 2 years per work to complete, ultimately. It's a very slow, very, it's a process, very performative in its own way. And I think that's something that perhaps very quickly gets overlooked, that our work doesn't exist within this very quick space. It's actually this continuous practice over a long period of time that also enables us to, through lived experience, have a very different understanding or tactile understanding of what these tools or technologies can mean.
Yeah, I think that idea of the other and questioning the idea of the technological other. I think, Sougwen, you also touch on some of those ideas, and so the criticism of kind of a lot of AI work or flattening a lot of AI work as insta plagiarism, I think, and just insta slop and a lot of the critiques that you hear. One thing that I think is especially interesting about how your work, Sougwen, challenges those critiques is that you see the other of the machine as a kind of self-portraiture. And it's something that we've talked about before. So it's not like a dialogue with this separate other, but it's actually an extension of yourself. And I'm interested in that, the level of trust that's required in the machine to invite it to be a part of yourself. And so how does AI specifically enable you to achieve that extension of yourself and to extend the embodiment of your practice to systems beyond your physical body? And how does that also support this idea of slowness and situatedness in your practice? So I'm wondering if how does instead of maybe AI replacing the artist in your way of using it, how is it more augmenting the artist?
I think in kind of response to this idea of the Insta art, but also kind of entangling these two questions together a little bit, I find myself thinking more about different modes of temporality, different modes of time, and in a lot of what the work is, in a lot of what the art practice is, a lot of what it means to kind of make something machine readable, but with kind of a researcher's mind and researcher's intention. We see how machine readable can be used in the way of scraping public and not public data to create visual systems. We've seen that. But I think in most of the artists in the space that we really admire and look to, that I really admire and look to, I think we're really in a different mode. Like, it takes 1 to 2 years to build some of these systems, and you're still finding new discoveries in a system from 2018. I resonate with that so much, in that so much of my work as I don't know if it's self-portraiture. I think it's sort of like self-disassembly in a way. I want to, it takes a very long time to make 2 decades of drawing physical drawings machine readable. It takes a lot of time to create a biofeedback system, which is actually meant to read one's alpha waves, which is your brain state at a heightened state of meditation and flow. All that is about stepping back and existing in a different mode of temporality beyond this infinite image generation kind of idea. So, and I was really struck by what was said before too, which is that I think we want slowness. I I think everyone, there's this really beautiful work at the Schaulager Foundation right now, which is it's a space in Basel to just make this really temporally located in the event we're at right now. But it's the McQueen exhibition where it's sound and color and an empty space. Okay, sure, the Schaulager space is particularly beautiful, but I think it's about that absence that allows you to experience in a deeper way and create meaning. And I think that about these practices that require more time. I used to be a violinist, so I think about instrumentation, and the violin doesn't evolve, but how Itzhak Perlman plays the violin versus how I play the violin is very, very different. And I think that's a measure of time. So to that point, working for 10 years with this machinic other as an idea has really allowed me to engage with the system that I built in 2015 based on that time. But there's a dynamism to it because the new models I'm training are on how my drawing has changed. So it's sort of, I think about that kind of collaboration as time travel in a way that's much more compelling to me than sometimes this idea of what AI can enable. I think that you could say that about wider technological systems, but I think there's something really special in these feedback loops that we can create through AI-driven systems and not. I think there's that feedback that's always really at the center. So.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned infinite image generation, and maybe we can move a little towards 2025 and some of the concerns of today. And one thing that is really exciting, some of the exciting things and maybe some of the not so exciting things. But one of the exciting things is that Sofia and Feileacan, your work will be shown at a show that happens to be titled Infinite Images at the Toledo Museum of Art. Maybe, I'm sure they did not consult us about that title. But it's Infinite Images, the Art of Algorithms. And it's at the TMA. It'll be opening in the middle of July, so in about a month. And yeah, it's a really exciting show for, I think, especially for artists like yourselves who've been in the space for years and a decade and who've are now getting a show at a museum that is explicitly interested in the core ideas of their work. So maybe you could tell us a bit about how you see the significance of that show, and maybe if you want to tell us anything about the work that you'll be showing there.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's of course, a great honor to be part of that, and it's curated by a most wonderful curator as well, which is fantastic. I think fundamentally what I really love about the show and the works is that it shows a great diversity in practice and focus. There are many different ways of working with algorithms. So, this notion or this label AI that gets stuck on everything these days, can refer to almost anything in reality, and is, really quite hard to actually understand what is meant by this. So for us, it's been really great, not only because we get to show one of our earlier works, Sediment Nodes, which was a work where we used neural networks, of course, but the goal of using these tools was to try and achieve a certain resonance with an experience from ourselves diving underwater. This work is this experience of diving in sediment-rich water, which often occurs, for example, in areas with high currents or after a storm, but is, you know, this fantastically rich world that emerges when you then take a torchlight deep underwater in this gray mass, and suddenly this color explosion of color and life emerges. So for us, this was a very interesting work to share. But the interesting thing is that simultaneously, a collaboration between Sofia and Anna Rittler is shown, which, you know, is also a very different kind of work, a very different kind of way of working with, you know, what many would assume would be the same algorithms or same technology. It's very different. And I think that this highlights, you know, some of, you know, what's meaningful about that show is that Julie has curated, you know, very different ways of using this technology over a longer period of time. And I think that that helps really highlight that there is such a diversity inherent to working with digital tools as part of the medium you're in, and that we really we should try very hard to avoid reducing our notions of art, which uses digital mediums, as somehow some very delimited, very sort of simplified model of expression.
Yeah, and well, this show is exciting for me because the way I'm participating in it is through two works that I've done in collaboration with two different people. So it's the first time that happens, and it has made me reflect on how much I love working with other people. You know, I have my solo practice, which is important for me to have that space, but it's amazing to just get to show work done with Feli and with Anna. But about this work, something that is meaningful to me about this work is that it was really born from diving. So something I really like is spending time underwater, and for me, it's kind of a mindfulness practice because every time I go underwater, I know that my time is limited there. And eventually, you know, like I will just run out of air, so I need to exit safely. But we went diving together in Madeira, I think, which is an island from Portugal. And it was really, there was a lot of sediment moving around, and we had to go with a torchlight because obviously the more sediment there is, the less visibility there is. And I remember Feli telling me there's something really amazing that when you shine the torchlight onto this sediment, it's actually full of color. And, you know, it's not, you would think, oh, it's just sediment, like brown stuff. And then I was like, oh, you know what? I was just listening to this podcast about this scientist that studies sediment underwater. And she was saying how people say, like, what a boring subject to study. But actually, marine sedimentation is really fascinating because in the sediments are the nutrients that keep the ecosystem alive, you know? It's a bit like the soil, right? But there's also a lot of carbon that is captured in the sediments underwater. So that's kind of what gave birth to this work called Sediment Notes, which was more of for us, kind of like a meditative way of trying to portray with our tools that experience we had diving.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that idea, I think, is also, it challenges the, people think of the water, I think, as just a surface. And yeah, I like how your work is challenging that. And also that sediment too, it's like, it's a mix of the organic and the inorganic, and it looks like the carbon flows the same way as the organic. And I think that those, those contrasts are really interesting. One thing about 2025 that I wanted to ask you about, Sougwen, is that you said that you started with this work in 2014, 2015, so you've been working on it for 10 years. But it feels like 2025 seems to be just only a 10-year wait, but it seems to be the year that that autonomous AI or ideas of autonomy in AI have finally reached the mainstream, maybe art world attention. And so there's a few examples of that. So earlier this year, there was Botto had a project, and this is an autonomous AI agent that is originally created by Mario Klingemann, and there's also another an autonomous agent called Kiki, and then there was a Christie's sale that ended up, I think, surprising some people, and all of this led to critical attention. So there was a piece in the art newspaper about all of this, and but you've described your so a lot of the conversation around autonomy was whether these artists are fully autonomous, and what does a fully autonomous artist mean. And so who better to ask? I mean, you're someone who's been thinking about this for 10 years, and you've described your approach as something closer to, or maybe the goal is more like co-inhabitants, as opposed to full autonomy. And so co-inhabitant seems to be like, it seems to me like there are steps to full autonomy, and that maybe co-inhabitants is one of those steps along a spectrum. And yeah, feel free to agree or disagree. And so as someone who's been thinking about these ideas for so long, do you sort of, where do you stand in the conversation about whether we've arrived at full autonomy? And if your goal is co-inhabitants with machines, might you ever explore a creative relationship with full autonomy?
It's a really interesting series of questions with a lot of nested values, even in how we could spend 4 hours talking about the word autonomy and what that means for different people. I think for some people it means sentience. I think for some people it means singularity. I think for some people it's a marketing strategy for a wave of AI hype that erases authorship of engineers, artists across the board. So we could sit here and talk about that. But I think that would be exhausting. It's very early. I really enjoyed this debate between Shannon Valor and Blazy Arcus, hosted by Kara Swisher, on this, where they kind of talk about this idea of autonomy in the context of intelligence. So much of what's driven me as a person, and also by extension the work, is post-human philosophy, inquiries into intelligence. And I went to LA for this, just to be in the audience, really, which relates to this idea of autonomy, because I think they really were able to communicate better than I can in the space of however long my answer is going to be, the promises and perils around how we think about autonomy and intelligence. On one hand, you could say that these systems and how we interweave them and nest them are creating a different form of intelligence. You could say that. I think certainly that's been a point of intrigue in my work. Like, how can I think about AI systems, embodied intelligence, all these things, all these ways that meaning and the structure of intelligence is evolving through wider data sets and kind of plurality of these systems. On the other hand, you could say that that's bullshit, and you could say that all intelligence is embodied and has a historicity and a cultural specificity that we can't so easily use words like autonomy or intelligence. So I really am interested in the space in between. I think that when it comes to specifically autonomous artists and autonomous art, I find that to be an interesting niche description, but I think what, as you were so eloquently describing in your practices, what art practice really is this sort of translation of the experience of sediment glowing and being able to reflect that awe into the work through one's tools in a medium. Mine is maybe the tension around relationality through these systems and examining that in performance and artifacts. So it's that lived experience. It's that land art homage. It's that that narrative aspect of art making that I think creates communities of meaning, and I think the autonomy sometimes invoked in the phrase autonomous artist, I think is actually quite low on the rung. I think we have so much further to go. You posited cohabitance as a step towards autonomy. I think we were thinking about autonomy in the Harold Cohen ages. And I think now we're in this more interesting relationality, plurality, temporality. So I think we're moving beyond that because it's, yeah, because I think that's what we want, right? So, yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, I guess I've always thought of full autonomy more conceptually like Lawrence Leck. I don't know if you're familiar with his ideas of full
Yeah.
autonomy, but of course, yeah, of course you know him. But I guess his ideas there are that the machine would need to make a choice to become an artist. So if I think he has a movie, one of his films about a satellite, a communication satellite in space that decides, that was programmed to just be a communication satellite with AI, but then decides of its own volition to become an artist, and then tries to land back on Earth. And yeah, what do you think of the sort of Lawrence Leckian idea of full autonomy and that being a requirement, that the machine would need to make its own choice?
Yeah, I love Lawrence's work. We just spoke at Art Week Riyadh with Schumann, Basser, and Matt Dryhurst, and we touched on some of those ideas. I think Lawrence's work creates a really brilliant speculative reality in which he narrativizes this within the world of the game and within these protagonists that he's built. I think it's an interesting discussion because, but I think there's something about the actual build and construction of intelligence in the world in which we live here, and how that idea has been agentialized and used in culture that live in different realities. I kind of want to live in Lawrence Leck's reality, but I think the reality we're in employs concepts of autonomy and the artificially general that that demands greater criticality and greater specificity in meaning.
Yeah, just to sort of, because I think what you said was really, really great in that regard. But I think also the question might very well be sort of, is autonomy a useful metric at all? As because one of the things is we are very poorly psychologically or sort of cognitively speaking, we're very poorly suited to deal with a technology which so far has no proven consciousness whatsoever. However, can produce fluent language that at first glance at least, or imagery that first glance appears to be the result of labor somehow. That you can generate an image that looks like it was painted by a person, and only on very careful examination does it appear that it's actually just generated, or text that appears lucid and well reflected. And the thing is, I think cognitively, it's because we have never encountered anything that can speak and sound like a human being that is not a human being. And we because of our cultural background, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of years of, if it communicates, if it speaks our language, if it sounds like us, it's probably one of us, and there may be, tribal politics and what have you. However, the reality is, we can safely assume that if someone speaks or if we see some form of image making, it's a result of another person at the other end. And I think that this leads us into a very dangerous territory when we're considering autonomy, where it's very hard for us to separate what at first glance might appear as a lucid, well thought through form of production of some kind from the actual reality of it. And of course, as artists who work with this technology, we have relatively sober and, down to earth understandings of what actually is going on behind the scenes. But I think this is also part of the problem we have with this, is that a lot of our language and a lot of our cultural, inertia and baggage makes us very poorly suited to discuss this in meaningful ways.
I was going to make a really bad joke about sobriety in Art Basel, but no, I think that idea of like, is autonomy really diving into, is that something that we want, and like sort of autonomy for whom? I think more this idea of autonomy sort of implies this separation, to get back to that too, from all these other categories of environment, of history, of bodies, and all that. So I think I'm not sure if that's what, even if it is, let's say that's all possible and fine, I'm not sure if it's really what we need or want. I'm not sure if that's not more of this idea, that more of what we've already had. We've understood what thinking of our of autonomy beyond the connectivity of our environment has sort of done for the wider ecological system and network. Again, I love the subversion of the land art thing with this practice of work. I think in my work as well, I think maybe the autonomy I'm chasing is my own, in that I want to understand these tools. I want to understand this data, and I want to have autonomy over my practice. You asked about trust in the machine. You can only trust what you understand. And I think we want autonomous artists, not autonomous artists, like not robotic production, but artists with greater autonomy over their tools and their meaning-making language in the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that when there's a danger to autonomy, and that when humans act autonomously, they are no longer considering the wider implications of their actions and the wider ecological impacts that they may have, and there's certainly a stark danger there. I'm also interested in the the human level autonomy, especially Sofia and Feileacan, of your solo practices, your collaborative practices with each other, and also, like you mentioned, Sofia, with Anna Ridler. How do you, in an entangled creative environment that you've constructed, how do you then separate your solo work from your entangled partners? And how does that philosophy then inform your own individual expression? And I'd like to hear from both.
Yeah, well, a big part that obviously isn't obvious from the outside is the process, the way of working, right? When we are two people, the process is gonna be different, right? When it's just me, then it's more, I think, well, I can only speak for the way that I approach my solo practice, is that the medium, the tools I use are just a way of getting to a place that I want to go, but they're not the way, the place that I want to arrive to. So the tools are just they're just a vehicle to get somewhere, to explore something that I'm interested in. I'm interested in exploring, like, what would what would it look like to imagine like a new natural history based on the natural history that we have illustrated? What does that look like? And I'm not interested in the neural network that I'm training or working with per se. I'm interested in exploring all of these variations. But when I work with Feli has a completely different approach, which he can obviously talk more about. But he is a systems thinker. And for him, it's very performative in the sense that it's important to create a system of rules and to follow those rules throughout. And that has been really enriching for me. It's kind of like my, I don't know, sometimes I call it my yin and yang in a way, because it kind of helps me balance my way of working, which is very output oriented in a way, with a way that is more process oriented. And it makes me connect with the process in a different way. And I know that maybe from the outside, that's not an obvious thing, you know, because we obviously have common subjects of interest, and I cannot erase that. I cannot, you know, suddenly pretend that I'm not interested in artistically thinking about the natural world, you know, and exploring it through my practice. But so something that you see, at least like if you visit our own websites, you know, our Duo website and my solo one, which is in the Duo website, we have diagrams, which is literally to explain the process that largely Feli designed, because otherwise people wouldn't understand really how the work was done. And we are trying to open that up more. So actually this work here is a good example, because this is the final work, and the process of generation is part of it. And for us, it was kind of like a way of opening that up, of being like, well, let's open up the system that we use to make it. That's the fun part, you know, that's an important part of the work. And I obviously in an artistic practice is an evolving thing, you know, it's not like we formed a duo and we're like, we know exactly where we're going, you know, it's kind of a process of unveiling over time. So we are also trying to figure out what things we're interested in. But yeah, just another thing that I'm interested in my solo practice that I've realized in the last few years, really, you know, is I'm interested in how humans look at the natural world more than studying only biology itself. I'm interested in how we project our view of the world onto the natural world and how we've done that throughout time. And in the work we do with Feli, I feel that because of this kind of systems-oriented thinking that Feli has, we have chosen to focus more on like the systems of the natural world. So looking at like large-scale you know, events that happen in the oceans. Not every work is about that, you know. Of course, we also have some works that are more like a specific meditation on something that we're interested in. But that's kind of where we've been, you know, drifting with our work. But yeah.
Yeah, I think you said it very well. I think from my aspect, I come from this point of view where nothing makes sense. The world does not make sense. How people think and respond to it, how things unfold, nothing of it makes sense to me. It's never has. So a lot of my work has been about trying to form some form of hypothesis or a framework to then kind of execute that to exhaustion, to try and test some way of either understanding the world or creating some kind of interface towards it, which somehow achieves some form of mutual resonance, where if it doesn't make sense, at least there's a shared space somehow in the perception of the world. And I think that that's been quite interesting for us as a duo practice, because basically Entangled Others is the sort of meeting in the middle. And from my end, I view technology as a means to producing useful frictions, because very often, how do you test an idea? How do you test a concept or hypothesis? You know, and the most productive way of doing that is introducing frictions, something that gives a resistance. So, you know, sometimes I'll create a data set, you know, for example, scanning, photographing, what have you, or synthesizing, and then I will manually sort of still spend hours just by hand going through each single image, if it's an image data set, as a way of, instead of automating that process, reintroducing a friction or creating something that willfully won't quite converge properly, so in the algorithm itself. So it pushes back at you. You have to really be clear about what you're trying to unfold, or how does this not match the expectations, as a way of learning or connecting with the world. And I think in terms of how we divide the work between us, I think because everything happens under one studio work, a lot of it's more about to which practice does the work we're discussing resonate, because in reality we discuss and share and support each other on all works produced. But it's about how it's what resonates more with what, and naturally over time things sort of usually crystallize into one or another form. And I think that that's the interesting thing, is how, and I mean, I'm sure you experience this as well, how as you develop a work, it does not necessarily go where you expected it to go, and the kind of friction, if you're lucky and the right frictions emerge, you may end up somewhere very different, or you might sort of start to tease the contours of a whole new avenue of research or exploration, or expression, if you will. And I think that that's really the interesting part. How do we not try and achieve, you know, some kind of result, but how do we achieve processes that push us somewhere beyond what we expected, that help us see the world differently or make sense of something that otherwise would be entirely cryptic?
Yeah, I'm interested in that idea of the historical lineage of technology helping us to understand, and that goes back to even cameras and lenses, and that's something that, Sofia, your work touches on a lot, where you link microscopes and cameras with neural networks that now organize how we process complexity. And so Walter Benjamin had a word for this. He called it the optical unconscious. And the optical unconscious is this idea that technology can make things invisible and hidden. It can reveal them. So just with, for example, with what Muybridge did with photographing horses, so you could see that their feet never touch the ground, or not never touch the ground, but only very briefly were not touching the ground when they were running. And I'm wondering, I'm interested in how those ideas of the optical unconscious with cameras and lenses, how they relate to what these newer technologies today then allow for us, like neural networks and deep learning systems. And so I think this is for all three of you, but maybe we can start with you, Sofia. What do you think deep learning systems reveal to you as an artist, and how do they shape the way that we process information today?
Yeah, so at least in my own journey, I was interested in making collages, before I started thinking about AI. And I was collaging things that I saw on the internet. Really, I became interested in AI because I started thinking, what does Google know about me that I don't know about myself in my browser history? And that led me to think about how Google had these AI models trained on my data. And I started thinking, how can I extract patterns from my own browser history? And it came from a completely different place to where I am now. But as I started to become interested in AI, at the same time, I had my microscope, because there were two parallel things that I did somehow. And it felt natural to combine them, to take, well, I have this tool, this algorithm, and I'm going to take the pictures that I took with my microscope and collage those digitally, right? And so it really came from a place of wanting to explore the space of possibility between those images. It started with very small data sets. And obviously, throughout the years and gaining access to more computation, we started to think about, well, what other patterns can we look at? And really, the way we see AI is as pattern extraction engines. And so that's something that became interesting to us, and that's why I think the artifacts, the noise, the weirdness is really interesting to explore. There's something in AI called overfitting, and that's when the model starts to get approximate way back to the original data set, to the point where it loses its capacity to imagine. And so that's a bad thing, obviously. I mean, if you're trying to find a space of like the imagination of the model, where it can blend things in a strange way, because you're back to the data set. You can replicate exactly the same image of the data set. So so I think like the interesting space with this technology is exploring how can we use it to imagine new things, and eventually it just became another tool for us. I think we don't think anymore about it in this way. Like, I think when I started, I was thinking about it more like, oh, I'm using this tool, what does it mean? But then with time, it kind of, all these ideas became more demystified. As you were saying, Sougwen, that we only trust what we know. I thought that was really interesting, because I think for me, I started learning more about the systems that I'm using through using them. And after you run the same algorithm hundreds of times, and you're like, okay, well, if I input this data, this is going to happen. But a lot of that learning was done also through breaking, through making mistakes. And something that you don't see here when you see these works is the amount of times that things were broken and just not working, and how painful it was to get it to work. But yeah, sorry, maybe I deviated from the original question, but.
No, I really love that though, because I think that idea that there's breakage in these systems. So I create performances, and I've been performing this practice as it's changed for 10 years. And I think part of the exhilaration of it, and part of what's at stake in a way in the performances, which are very meditative and very based on movement and bodies and attention, is this idea that the system, as you know in the creative process very well, it's not about creating a perfectly executable system, but it's about kind of finding meaning and working with the breakages of the system, even the most well-intentioned and designed systems. So I think it's as artists working with these tools, I think we know that, and I think it resonates with me a lot, because it's something I've lived through in performance, where it really changes people's expectations when they realize that fallibility is really integral to the work too. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about this like subversion of the tool. And so there's a computational philosopher that I really like, and I know is also Matt and Holly have I've spoken to him, and so that might you might be familiar with him. His name is A.A. Kavya, and so he talks about he equates intelligence with the exploration of a space. And I guess, Sougwen, I'm interested in your practice is an exploration of a pictorial space. And well, I mean, it in some ways it takes place on a canvas, and there's a pictorial aspect to what you're exploring. I mean,
I can talk to that. Yeah.
Okay. But how does that exploration of a creative space, how does it connect to an exploration of like a deep learning space and a machine learning space, and how do you see those two as connected?
I guess I'll respond first to the sort of pictorial aspect of it. So I think that a lot of what we see in like Gen AI today is really has so much to do with this continuation of the lens of photography, right? Because it's about training these models on images. I train my models on movement data, movements of EEG in my brain waves, but also my own drawing data. So I think that's a really important distinction, if only because that's the language that I know. I know drawing. I trust drawing, and drawing as a wider extension of movement and sort of an embodied cognition. This is not what a lot of generative models or even what we would maybe think of as or like a GAN or it's not really what they do. So I work with recurrent neural networks, which actually have that mode of time and movement as part of the structure, as part of its architecture to create this feedback loop. So, and I'm interested in that because I do think reacting to this idea of the pictorial. The pictorial is kind of a finished certainty or subjectivity in a lot of ways, but the drawn image is really about the process of constructing. It's about the process of thinking through linear time, and that's really what the models and interaction systems that I build are trying to investigate in terms of how do we make decisions through time? How do we fill the space of a canvas or a dimensional space, which is the new model, the 3D recurrent neural network we're building now? How do we kind of co-navigate this type of muscle memory with gesture in order to create new kind of sort of neurons firing, new ways of thinking through in an embodied sensibility, not just something on the screen, but something that extends to the world around us in a embodied physical way. So I think it's an important distinction to kind of make about this idea of embodied cognition, really inspired in the early days by this researcher named Andy Clark, and extending the ways that we use deep learning models and machine learning models to really ignite the process of thinking first, if that makes sense.
No, yeah.
I know it's early for that.
Well, yeah, it's I believe we are approaching 5 minutes. Okay, so only 5 more minutes, and then everybody can stretch their legs and have a coffee. And so we'll close with a light-hearted topic of fears and anxiety of AI today.
Great.
Yay.
I'm just wondering, what is the artist's role in those fears? How can artists show that it's okay to live with that fear, but also hope around these technologies, and that maybe we can, maybe that can be something we can briefly touch on. But maybe Feileacan, would you like to start, please?
I'm not honestly certain that it's my job to try and make everyone feel better. Sorry, but basically, the thing is, a lot of the uses we see of technology now are driven by, industrial scale processes run by massive corporations and nation states and so forth. And quite frankly, whether that's a good or a bad thing, is entirely up to who's talking. However, as an artist, I mean, there are very good reasons to be scared. There are a lot of things that are terrible. There are a lot of fantastic things you can do. Like, You can use, I mean, it ultimately boils down to, you know, if somebody has used a spoon to do something terrible, do you still want to use a spoon, right? And the reality is it's just a spoon. You may do something terrible, there may be no spoon, there's a spoon, but ultimately it's just a spoon. And I think our role as artists, at least from my perspective, is to be present in where we are, to try and somehow, if it's making sense or interacting or getting to know ourselves better or exploring some aspect we're fascinated with, and to use, you know, and to seize whatever tools, technologies, mediums that we see fit as relevant or resonant to our practice. But the reality is you should be terrified and angry when it comes to, you know, the sort of how corporations behave with your personal data. Like, I'm sorry, but that's not I can't offer you any sort of things. All I can do is, you know, explore technologies, explore and show that this is what I'm interested in. This is what I see as beautiful or resonant or interesting, or potentially terrifying if I ever get around to making something terrifying. But my point is, ultimately, I think just because, especially because the narratives around technology and art have become very much willfully conflated because they create this beautifully diffuse space which is very hard to critically engage with. I think a lot of the burden has weirdly enough been conflated between artists and corporations here. Well, so we get shackled with a lot of the responsibility of trying to make sense and maybe clean up the mess. And frankly, you know, I'm not having it. You know, I just can't do that. So, I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but I think that there is a huge problem of language in how we appropriate responsibility versus how do we allow space for sense making. Because the thing is, art can be good and bad, and I don't mean that in the qualitative sense, but in terms of morals and ethics, you know, there are so many ways even an artist can be, you know, entirely, you know, way out of line, or they can be, you know, part of that. Like, art in itself has no guarantees of anything, positive or negative either. It comes down to the practitioner and the artist, and I think that it's very important that we try to maintain that separation of, you know, what are the greatest motions in society and how individuals respond and react in that, and where do we find personally things that are relevant or interesting to us, because that's the beauty of art, is that everybody works differently. There are so many different diverse ways, and the goal here isn't to solve anything. There is no product, there is no goal. It's this ongoing thing that maybe can be resonant to you, maybe can help you navigate or understand or see something differently, and that's the interesting bit. But there is no hope or fear or, you know, in that regard, on a more general level. Sorry about that.
No, I enjoyed it. So, yeah.
Well, no, I'm just, this made me think about a recent Q&A that I did where someone asks me, how does your work address the fact that the Paleolithic glaciation event was ended by human impact on the natural world, and today with the use of AI, you're contributing to the impact of the, and I was like, my work is not about that. It is obviously part of the landscape, yes, of course, and I am really interested in that, but it doesn't mean that the work I do has to address that, you know, and it also doesn't mean that I have to be a spokesperson for that, because it puts an unnecessary pressure on us. You know, there's this idea that because we're using AI, we're part of this platform of, you know, like exploitation of data, but really we have 4 GPUs at home, and we have them because we collaborated with NVIDIA and they gave us GPUs for free. So, you know, like, we were lucky in that sense, and I'm really grateful for that. But there's this notion that we have, you know, like a corporate size data farm, that we are farming everyone's data to make this work, and that's just not true. You know, we went diving, we took some pictures, we trained our little algorithm, and these kind of like imposed idea that we are part of that, you know, sometimes just feels kind of unfair. But I always have to remind myself that that's just because the majority of the media that we have today is really focusing on that one particular story, you know, of the models trained by corporations. And a lot of people just don't know about these kind of practices, you know. So, yeah.
And just to interject, that isn't to say that we don't adopt full responsibility for our work and the consequences of our work. But the thing is, what we're doing, you know, doesn't exist in the same realm as, for example, a massive data center training a foundational model. Now, I think it's very important that we don't, this isn't a cop-out. We're not trying to say that we're not responsible for the work and the impact of our work and those things. But what work we're talking about is very important in this context. I think the same also applies for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I've, because we speak about the work as well, and I've definitely, especially in like the Q&A sometimes, these questions come up. It's always the Q&A. Yeah. I've had a version of that, which we can talk about later too. But I think it's, yeah, there is this tension, I think, that artists are feeling around like make us feel better, right? And I understand that. We understand that. I love that rejection too. I think we shouldn't look to artists to editor, because in some ways, if we make you feel better about the work, we're kind of editorializing it in a way that is disingenuous. So I don't know anyone who wants to do that. Well, I do actually know a lot of people who want to do that, but that's not us. That's not how I feel either. But I think about my earliest interest in this work, which was, it really came from drawing and performance. So and here we are at a sort of Gen AI, sort of a digital art mile kind of space. It's a subsect of a wider dialogue happening at Art Basel, that I think maybe, and this is just speculative, maybe if we connected ourselves more to the practice, like the history of drawing and the evolution of drawing or the evolution of land art, then I think some of the tension comes from being siloed into this category that's really kind of existed for like 5 minutes. So it's really hard to understand that, but when you think of it as like, oh, we care about looking at nature, or I care about drawing and performance, then that we have a lot more in common with a lot more people if we think about medium as a through line versus ways in which we're using the tools of our generation to explore the older mediums of observation and capture. So yeah, I guess that's sort of my thinking about what artists, what widening or thinking artists can do in 2025.
No, yeah, I think that's amazing, and I think the importance of context, of art historical conversations, and also, like you said, Feileacan, art as a space for contemplation about these issues, not necessarily for answers. So, yeah, thank you all so much for listening, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.